Hey, it's Dan with EUJUICERS.COM, coming to you as always from our offices here in the heart of Europe. In this video, I'm going to do a comparison between horizontal slow juicers and vertical slow juicers. If you're looking to buy a juicer, a common question we get is, hey, which one's better? And there is no real best answer. It depends what you're going to be doing, what you're going to juice, what you want to use your machine for. Now, what I want to do is explain some of the differences physically, and then I'll go over some factors where one might be a little better than another. And finally, I will actually do a juicing. I'll juice one of my favorite recipes, and I'll see how it does with yield, with pulp, the taste, things like that, and then just wrap it up with some concluding thoughts. So physically, let's take a look at these. Both of these machines operate on the same principle. You've got a motor turning an auger, pushing produce down against a screen, and that produce or pulp gets pushed against the screen, juice comes out, pulp comes out the end. Now the way they do it is quite a bit different though. Horizontals have been around a little longer. They're a little simpler design. There's not much to it. You can see produce goes down here. There's an auger that pushes the produce, and it pushes it against this tiny little screen. I want to show you this screen here real quick. It's very small, and an advantage of that is it's a lot easier to clean. Horizontals are going to be easier to clean than verticals. That's a point I'll cover at the end as well. On the other hand, there's a lot less surface area, so potentially juicing could take a little longer. Here's a vertical screen. This is a coarse screen. Normally we would juice with a fine screen, but you can see the surface area is a lot bigger. There's a lot more area for the produce to be pushed by that auger and juiced out. Another difference is how the pulp is handled. In a horizontal, the pulp just goes straight out. There's no channeling of it. The juice comes down the bottom out here. The pulp just shoots out here. In a vertical, it's a little more complicated. You've got the juice coming out here, but there's little channels or little grooves under the juicing chamber, and the pulp will come out here. And one disadvantage of that is it's a little more complex to clean. So that's something to keep in mind. Now physically, the other thing to keep in mind is the size of them. You can see the footprint of a horizontal is a lot bigger than a vertical. Vertical will fit on your counter much more easily. Unless you have low cabinets, you want to keep that in mind too, because they do tend to be a lot taller. So let's talk about some factors that might be important to you as you're looking into buying a juicer. One would be preparation of ingredients. How small do you have to cut things? One thing to keep in mind is verticals come in two types, kind of a standard mouth vertical and a wide mouth. I'm going to put a link below where I compare all the different types of feeding tubes on verticals, and that's if you really want to go into depth to help you make your decision. This one here, this is the Sauna 828. It's our newest vertical juicer that we offer here at EU Juicers. Sauna just came out with this a couple of months ago, and it kind of has a hybrid feeding tube here. It has a standard hole here and then a much bigger hole here. We've got a detailed review of the 828. I'll link that below as well. This is the Sauna 707, and most horizontals have the same type of feeding tube. But in terms of prep, cutting your ingredients, generally speaking, with a standard feeding tube vertical, you might want to cut things a little smaller, surprisingly enough, because they will tend to jam a bit more on hard root vegetables. Whereas with the horizontal, you're handling all the pushing. I'd be pushing a big fat carrot through myself. You basically can't jam a carrot in a horizontal. I never have, and I've been using one for 5 years now. In a vertical, it's going to jam almost all the time. So prep time for hard root vegetables, things like that, you do want to cut things a little smaller here. Otherwise, they're pretty equal. Another factor to keep in mind is how long does it take? Well, in this recipe, I'll time it out. I'm talking total time. That's prep, that's juicing time, and then that's cleaning time. You want to keep all those factors in mind, because that's what's going to help you if you're going to buy a juicer and if it's going to sit on the counter and get used every day, or if it's going to sit out in the garage or in a cabinet and not. Something that's fast, especially easy to use, that tends to be used more. Speaking of ease of use, let's talk about that too. Which of these are easier to use? Well, one thing to keep in mind, verticals are self-feeding. It has a pusher, but you'll almost never need it, except for maybe leafy greens, things that might expand into the feeding tube a bit. Horizontals, you do have to push. You got to work with it. They'll kind of self-feed. I was just juicing a kilo of carrots last night at my house, and I put some little tiny carrots in, and they kind of slowly juiced on their own. But really, you need to push a lot on your own. Whereas with a vertical, you just put them in, it cuts them, it feeds them themselves. Now, on the other hand, a point for the horizontals, they're easier to put together. They're simpler. There's less parts involved. You can assemble a horizontal in just a few seconds. Vertical, you got to line things up a bit. You've got to line up the auger and the cleaning fins, the blades that clean it, and the screen. So it's a little more time to assemble. And then what I mentioned before, that little screen in the horizontal means it's easier to clean. So that could be a big bonus for some people. A lot of times here at lunchtime, I'll make some juice, and I've got a choice of 30 juicers out there. And it usually comes down to one of these or something similar to this. And most of the time, I'll either grab a wide mouth vertical, but then again, that's going to take a lot longer to clean. Most of the time I grab one of these because I'm familiar with it, a Sauna 707, because I know it's going to be super fast to clean up. So that's something to keep in mind. Another factor you might want to consider is yield. How much juice will you get from your produce, or how easy are these machines to work with different types of produce? Now, generally speaking, let's divide produce into 3 categories: soft fruit, hard fruit, and root vegetables, and then greens. Soft fruit, this guy's going to do the best. Verticals tend to do really well on soft fruit, especially if you use something like this, a coarse screen. This model also comes with a coarse screen. It'll do okay on soft fruit, but we find verticals do the best. Excuse me. Now moving over to hard produce like root vegetables, things like that. Now that's where the horizontal's going to have an advantage. The vertical might get you slightly better yield, but the horizontal won't jam like I mentioned before. It's a lot easier. You can put the fattest carrot you can in there. It'll juice it no problem without jamming. Same with beets, things like that. But then again, you might get slightly better yield. You might get slightly clearer juice from the vertical. So those are pretty close. Finally, with leafy greens, horizontals almost always tend to do better. Verticals do fine with leafy greens as long as you alternate some other harder ingredients. If you just put a bunch of spinach in a vertical or some softer leafy greens, kale and things, it'll juice it, but the results won't be as good as the horizontal. But if you use some carrots, mix things up like that, it'll be fine. So overall, in terms of ingredients, soft fruit, things like berries, better over here. Hard root vegetables, slightly better over here. Greens, definitely better over here. And one other factor before I start juicing that could be a big factor is versatility. Now, horizontals are designed to be really versatile. It's just their design. You can attach different things here, and almost always they come with a homogenizing screen, which is really rare on a vertical. Basically what it means is verticals are specialist juicer machines. Horizontals are juicers, plus they can do more. I'm talking about things like grinding coffee, making nut butters, making baby food, you know, putting cooked vegetables and maybe meat into one of these. It will mince it together. My wife uses our 707 almost every day for grinding herbs. She collects them in the forest, dehydrates them, and then found that she can get a much better result here than by doing it by hand with a mortar and pestle. You can even add an attachment. For example, like this guy here, this is the Sauna oil extractor. This works with several models of horizontal juicers. And this will let you make oil as well as oat flakes, but oil from all sorts of nuts and seeds. So it's just a lot more versatile, basically. So that kind of really encapsulates the difference. What I want to do now is do a juicing recipe, see how they do, and then we'll just wrap it up with some concluding thoughts. So what I have here is just a standard juicing recipe. I've weighed out 1 kilogram of carrots, cut them, prepared them the same, 250 grams of baby green spinach, and then 1 Granny Smith apple for each. They weigh approximately the same. And what I'm looking for here is just ease of use, you know, how does the juicing experience go? And also looking at the yield, how much juice do I get? And then I'll taste them both at the end. Probably will taste a bit more pulp in this guy, we'll see. And this one might be a bit sweeter and clearer. And I also expect, with this size of carrot, probably to get a few jams in the vertical. That's just normal for verticals, nothing at all here. All right, so I guess I will start with the vertical. So I just hit stop. That took 7 minutes, 15 seconds. Tilt it a little, get all the juice out. And I guess I wasn't telling the truth because it didn't jam at all on carrots. Normally when I use a vertical, it will jam on carrots. That can also depend on the quality of the carrots. If they're fresher, they're less likely to jam. I also kept these guys soaked in water for about an hour before we filmed, just to keep them from kind of wilting. So otherwise, let's see, what's the yield on here? About just a little over 700 milliliters. Again, that's from a kilo of carrots, 1 apple, and 250 grams of spinach. Process was easy. Self-fed, I did have to use the pusher for the spinach. If you noticed, you saw I push the spinach in here, which is kind of handy, with my hand, and then push it down with the pusher. And there were a couple of times, like with the apples, where one sort of sat on the top and kind of rode the wave of the auger, and I had to help it out a bit. But otherwise, real easy to use a vertical. Just drop the things in, and this big tray does help with things like leafy greens. So I'll reset my clock here. It was 7 minutes 15, and try the same thing now on the horizontal. All right, so 5:52, so quite a bit faster. This was 7:15, this is 5:52. And a lot of that was probably because the carrots, with a horizontal, you can force the carrots through. With a vertical, you let it slowly eat them on their own. And this would do a little self-feeding. With smaller carrots, it was actually cutting little chunks off. But definitely with the greens and with the apples, you need to push them through. And I did manage to get 1 or 2 spinach leaves in. That's always a challenge when you've got a smaller feeding hole like this. You just got to cram them together and shove them in. But let me look at the yield here and see. It's a little hard to tell because there's layers, you know, of spinach and a bit of foam. But this one looks like it's about, I would say 650, most likely. I'll look a little closer before I drink it. So what I want to do now is try these, see if I can tell a consistency difference. A little spinach got in there. Again, one last look now that it's settled. I'd say just a hair over 700 milliliters there. And more like 650 here. Let's see how they look in a glass. There goes that spinach leaf. Color's about the same. Let's see how they taste. It's a nice basic recipe. It tastes fine. Definitely lighter, if that makes sense. There's a heavier taste to this. Or texture. A little bit more pulp in there, I would say. Definitely clearer juice on this side. So overall, let's just wrap things up here. Which one's best for you? Well, if you want just a strict juicing machine, you probably want a vertical, something that will not do other things. You can get some verticals, like this one, for example. The Sona comes with a sorbet screen. Some big mouth verticals, you can get an optional homogenizing screen, but still they're not as versatile here. But this is just a pure juicer, easier to use, takes a little longer to clean, fits better on the counter. Horizontal, you want this if you want something more versatile, something that can do a lot more than just juicing, something that's easier to clean if counter space isn't an issue. And price-wise too, horizontals tend to cost a little less than verticals, so that's something to keep in mind. They're a little simpler machines. So, you know, they each have their pros and cons. Juice quality was really similar. Yield was slightly better out of the vertical. And again, keep in mind a clearer juice out of the vertical, a more full-bodied taste out of the horizontal. So I hope you found that useful. Please leave any comments or questions below here. We'll have links to the videos I mentioned previously, so you can see a little more in depth about the differences between these two. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'm Dan with EUJUICERS.COM, and I'll see you next time.